On August 19th, 1825, representatives from almost every Midwestern tribe signed a treaty at the trade point of ToPdC, which would eventually lead to the almost complete removal of the tribes in the Wisconsin area.
For thousands of years, Indians had lived in North America, unaware of civilization half a world away. Their lifestyle would soon have to adapt to new cultures, weapons, disease, and ideas of land ownership.
That one could no more sell land than they could sell air. It was simply there for everyone's one's use.
And say, I don't know any boundaries. There are no boundaries. And then, of course, the treaty commissioners say, see, they don't know what their land is, so we can take it.
By the 1700s, Europeans had set up successful trade routes with several of the Indian tribes in the Midwest, the most important commodity being fur.
And so the people who were involved in the fur trade, the relationship was very good with the Native Americans. But then you have the Yankees coming. And
European settlers first came to the area to trade for fur to sell in Europe, but as minerals were discovered in the Midwest, such as lead, more and more eyes turned to the Indian country. But the settlers could not go in since there was fighting between the tribes, and it was said to be too dangerous.
And so consequently, the federal government wanted to stabilize this environment so that the trade goods, the pelts, the furs, could come out of Indian country.
The War of 1812 left many Indian nations in the Midwest at the mercy of the United States government, but the government saw it as a potential chance for the Indian people to side with the British one more time, who were still upset because they were defeated.
well, certainly any wars that went on affected Indians because people tried to make them allies.
The U.S. government viewed it as necessary to create treaties with the Indian people and make sure they did not side with the British again. A decade after the end of the war, the United States government started making treaties with the defeated Indian people. The Treaty of ToPdC was the first treaty signed in the Midwest.
This treaty was considered one of peace and friendship between the Indian people and the U.S. government, similar to the first treaty ever signed, the Treaty of Fort Stanwix in the 9 Mile Prairie.
Proposed. Why would the government invite Native people to a treaty signing just for peace and friendship? What would be the government's motivation? Well, there really isn't any, so you have to look for other reasons.
To decide on their boundaries so that when they came in to buy the land, which was the intent all along, they agreed among themselves where this tribe and another one began. And
14,000 Indians from 7 tribes were at the signing of the Treaty of ToPdC, as well as American explorer and diplomat William Clark.
The 1825 treaty affected all the Indian nations that now, in the area that now is Wisconsin.
This treaty in itself wasn't going to take away the land, but instead to identify the land for further treaties.
The Treaty of 1825 set the wheels in motion for the loss of land by all the tribes that were living in the area that became Wisconsin at the time.
The Treaty of ToPdC defined the boundaries between the Midwestern Indian tribes.
And it can't negotiate land cession treaties with the Indian nations that live in the area until it knows who owns what land.
As land cession continued through the Midwest, it was soon realized that the inevitable end for the Indians was that they would have to leave their ancestral homelands behind.
Sauk Chief Black Hawk was one of the many tribal leaders who was affected by the Treaty of ToPdC and later treaties. When his tribe lost all of their land in 1832, he led an uprising southwest into Iowa where they were massacred by United States troops. He fled northeast back into Wisconsin until he and his followers surrendered in the 9 Mile Prairie just east of Prairie du Chien. This was the first of many conflicts with heavy losses towards the Indians, including the Sandy Lake tragedy, where the United States government did not supply food and water to an agreed location, which left 400 dead, and the Trail of Tears, leaving over 4,000 Cherokee Indians dead.
More than just land cession treaties, the United States government made several acts concerning the Native Americans, including the Indian Removal Act, the Presidential Removal Order, and the Indian Citizenship Act. All of these acts were intended to force the Indians to assimilate into American culture or, as the Indian Removal Act explicitly stated, to remove the Indians.
The United States never truly honored their treaties. The Oneida was once promised $400,000, which had already been set aside by the government, but they only received $33,550. And in 1887, the Dawes Act was passed, where the Indians were given plots of land that they would own. But the Indians knew no better than to sell it to timber companies, and they lost even more of their land. But nowadays, the United States government has been trying to help Indians with pieces of legislation such as the Indian Reorganization Act, where the United States government helped set up Indian governments, and the Indian Self-Determination Act, which allowed the Indian tribes to take loans from the federal government to set up schools and hospitals. With the Indian Citizenship Act mentioned before, it granted citizenship to all the Indians in the country. While it is debated what the reason was, either to assimilate the Indians or thank them for their effort in World War I, it now allows them to hold office in the United States government.
Paraphrase it. Our young people today, at some point in the future, you will see them sitting in the halls of government.
The treaties are still very much in effect today.
Are not obsolete. They'll never become obsolete because they gave up land in exchange for promises. Sometimes education, sometimes money, sometimes treaty rights in the case of the Ojibwe. So those treaties are not something that just gets old and moldy and irrelevant. They will always be relevant to the people who sign them.
While the treaties will always be in effect with the Native American tribes, they affect each tribe differently.
Involved in those treaties, the tribes retain. They keep those rights.
By 1827, which was only 2 years after the Treaty of Prairie du Chien, the second treaty in the Midwest was signed, effectively taking away land from the Menominee and Ojibwe. In years to come, many more treaties would be signed, almost every time by people who did not have the authority to sign for the tribe. This would eventually lead to the almost complete removal of the Indian nations in the Midwest.
This process continued west in a cycle that would keep the Indians moving.
These treaties continued west, keeping the Indians moving further and further away from their homelands. In the eyes of the United States government, these treaties successfully assimilated the Indian nations, but from the Native American perspective, the treaties were responsible for their loss of land and tragic events such as the Trail of Tears and Sandy Lake tragedy.
Yo